Good afternoon and welcome to the CERIAS Security Seminar from Purdue University. Our speaker today is from VeriSign. He's going to be speaking, his name is Andrew Skolnick, and he'll be speaking about the cybersecurity landscape, trends, predictions, and long-range security disruptors. Go for it.
All right. Like he said, I'm Andrew Skolnick. I run the Applied Vulnerability Research Lab for VeriSign's iDefense group. And what that means is I supervise a bunch of guys who look kind of like this guy here. They all work pretty hard. They try and uncover dangerous hacks into popular software programs, hopefully before the bad guys do. Now, I've got a lot of ground to cover today, so I'll ask that you hold any questions till the end of the presentation. So I'll be starting with a discussion of some key headlines from the recent past, in particular, a few law enforcement success stories. Next, I'll try and characterize for you a few of the important regions around the world that have essentially been hotbeds of hacker activity. Then I'll highlight some evolutionary trends and developments in the hacking world and in the criminal underground within cyberspace. All of this, I hope, will demonstrate to you that we've kind of, as a community, blown through a bunch of tipping points in the cybersecurity landscape. Finally, we'll wrap up by looking at the iDefense crystal ball, and I'll try and identify for you some developments that we believe are going to significantly impact cybersecurity over the next few years. We call these things security disruptors. First, let me tell you a little bit about iDefense real quick. VeriSign's iDefense group is made up of 8 primary teams that work together to discover, synthesize, and research various information regarding to the current status of the cybersecurity landscape. These teams include intelligence analysts who are fluent in over 20 foreign languages, security researchers and experts whose knowledge literally covers the spectrum of today's information technology. As these people feed a steady stream of information, analytical reports, etc., to our editorial group, they keep us looking good and keep us out of trouble. The result is what we provide to our customers, which are periodic global and specifically focused technology reports, and they culminate at the end of the year in a summary of current trends in cybersecurity. During the course of the year, iDefense periodically updates the material and presents it to various customers, agencies, public forums, and of course universities. We also make some predictions in the report, and to date 15 of the 19 that we made last December have proven correct. Of the 4 that remain, one of them was kind of a borderline issue, but we're taking it kind of as a missed call. And when I explain a little bit later about fast flux, you'll see why. So for now, let's start talking about the cybersecurity landscape and what's been going on since 2009. As iDefense compiled last year's trends paper, there were 3 clear themes that emerged. Anybody familiar with this book by Malcolm Gladwell? We at iDefense very much like his concept of a tipping point. In fact, we think that the cybersecurity landscape has hit several in recent years and has changed pretty radically as a result. So much so that it no longer resembles what it was just 5 years ago. Today we're going to discuss some of the things that are influencing this change in landscape. Anybody out there familiar with this old TV show from the 1980s? We've got one taker. These 2 guys in the picture used to do battle with all these big drug cartels. Well, at iDefense, we think that the hacker groups that are in operation today very much resemble these drug cartels from the 1980s, and I'll go into detail about why. Finally, there's been a lot of activity lately regarding infrastructure. The bad guys this year and last have been spending a considerable amount of their resources building up their infrastructure. They've improved efficiency and stealth and facilitated how they attack our infrastructure for profit. So we'll go into how. Let's get started with some headlines. The press hyped a number of partial vulnerability disclosures this year and last year, many of which targeted critical internet infrastructure. These guys were responsible for some of the more prominent ones. This new trend highlights the need that some security researchers feel for garnering greater media attention for their efforts. They purposely didn't provide full details of what they researched, claiming that they were trying not to aid malicious actors in exploiting the weaknesses. Unfortunately, their efforts fail, because as soon as one of them publishes anything of note, every other researcher in the community begins a relentless pursuit to discern what the missing content was. The original authors claim that they're withholding the information to protect the community, but their vague announcements only serve to focus attention on the problem. At iDefense, we practice what's called responsible disclosure by notifying an impacted vendor prior to disclosing the information and not going public with it until the vendor has a patch. This is sometimes a frustratingly slow process, but for the most part it works. We don't begrudge those guys their efforts to get their 5 minutes of fame for their really awesome research, but their partial disclosures are clearly not having their intended effect. And unfortunately, we believe that you can expect to see more of them in the near future. So, while we're on the topic of high-profile events, the law enforcement community has had a few very visible successes since last year. For example, these guys, working with these guys, arrested 2 individuals that were associated with this group. Kaspersky's lab even modified the Shadowbot code to allow the police to take unprecedented control of the command and control servers. Hopefully, other law enforcement agencies around the world will start following that lead. We believe that the more aggressive model is the right one for attacking botnets. Which brings us to this story. Anyone track this back in March? In England, the BBC decided to do a story on botnets. So they went out, found one they could afford, and bought some time from one. And they got slammed for it in the press. And from the worldwide law enforcement community for going outside the law. This guy was one of their louder critics. Rather than working outside the law, he was working with Dutch law enforcement as part of Kaspersky's team when they brought down the shadow botnet. They did it the right way, working with law enforcement. Okay, some of you are probably familiar with this guy here. He was all over the news this summer. He's a Cuban-American computer hacker who's been closely tied to some of the most prominent, high-profile corporate breaches in history. Most recently, using the handle SegVec and working with 3 co-conspirators, he ripped off 150 million credit card numbers from one of the major payroll service bureaus and several other large companies. He's got a pretty interesting story. Back in 2002, using the handle Kumbajani, he helped mastermind the former Shadow Crew carding forums, which is probably, by the way, where he met this guy who was intimately involved with Shadow Crew. More on him in a minute. By April of 2003, Gonzalez had been caught by the U.S. Secret Service. He opted to become an informant for them rather than do jail time. Working with the feds, he convinced most of the Shadow Crew community to use a special VPN to hide from law enforcement. But the VPN was actually a sting operation set up by the U.S. Secret Service, who were able to watch everything that went on the forum. They dubbed it Operation Firewall at the U.S. Attorney's Office, and several major shadow crew members managed to elude capture, probably because Gonzalez tipped them off. Among those who escaped was his buddy Zoomer. Overall, though, the sting was extremely successful. It resulted in the indictment of 19 of the people who were arrested. In fact, it was so successful that Gonzalez was able to convince the Secret Service to keep him on for a while. They kept him on for 4 years. But it turns out that he had other things in mind that he wanted to play with while he was in their employ. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a second, because I'm getting ahead of myself. With Shadow Crew gone, there remained one English-speaking carding criminal forum, Dark Market. It quickly became the main watering hole for thousands of identity thieves, hackers, and credit card fraudsters. That's when this guy, using the hacker name Master Splinter, infiltrated the forum of Dark Market for the FBI. And he was so effective at it that he became Dark Market's sysadmin in 2006. As a result, the FBI was able to collect a lot of valuable information on key fraudsters that had been using the forum, until about a year ago, when Turkish law enforcement arrested this guy. He's a notorious ATM skimmer, and he's also a very nasty underworld criminal who's happened to be a senior member of Dark Market. So, when the arrest went public, a slew of other organizations around the world began poking around the Dark Market forums. So the FBI decided that it would be prudent to close the operation down before their cover was blown. Working together with several of these organizations, they managed to arrest some 56 criminals, including this guy, who, by the way, is also currently in the custody of Turkish law enforcement. His disk drive, captured by the authorities, provided tons of evidence that they eventually shared with the U.S. for use against this guy. He sold Maxim most of the illegal card numbers that he'd been using, which brings us back to this past May, when our old friend Kumbajani, under his new alias of Segvac, began working with Maxim to steal over 150 million credit card numbers from Heartland, TJ Maxx, and many other big companies. Using multiple other aliases and storing data remotely on encrypted hard drives around the world, Gonzalez succeeded in hiding these activities until early 2008, when the data from Maxim's disks, which was shared with the U.S. law enforcement, finally revealed his activity to the feds. In May of 2008, the feds staged a series of raids targeting Gonzalez, who they now realized had been the mastermind of multiple ongoing credit card fraud schemes. They also learned that Gonzalez and Maxim were aided in part by this class act, who they recruited to write a sniffer called Blah Blah. Great imagination there. It did the legwork for the data heist that siphoned off info from TJX and the other forums. Gonzalez, by the way, is currently in jail, awaiting sentencing later this month, after pleading guilty in September. He's facing 15 to 20 years in prison. And in the Justice Department's report, he'll be forfeiting $2.7 million, about $1 million of which they found buried in cash in his backyard. All right, let's move on and take a broader look at things. In the past year, 3 regions with the greatest amount of criminal cyber activity outside the U.S. have probably been Russia, China, and Brazil. These are hotbeds of cybercrime and other activity, and they've given us a lot to think about in the past, including now. Although their government has been keeping an eye on the internet for years in Russia, Activity in cyberspace is now just starting to be regulated. Within the Russian Federation, no clear lines demark the criminal underworld from the official business economy or from the state. Cybercrime is an ingrained and distinguished feature of the country's socioeconomic landscape. It is not that the Russian government is carrying out attacks directly. Affiliated support groups such as the youth group Nashi and state-controlled ISPs are the more visible culprits in unofficially sanctioned attacks. One of the highest profile Russian-related incidents took place just this past summer when a series of attacks in early August targeting Facebook, Twitter, and LiveJournal attempted to silence a single Georgian hacker who was blogging against Russia's involvement in the conflict in South Ossetia. Those DDoS attacks were believed to be the work of political entities within Russia, including the Federal Security Service, or FSB. They're the ones that replaced the KGB when the Soviet Union broke up. Officially, the Russian parliament has been busy crafting legislation to take tighter control of internet activity. They already enacted laws allowing the government to shut down any site deemed to be extremist and to suspend the license of any ISP uncooperative in removing them. This and other pending legislation is clearly setting the stage for even broader government monitoring and control. Part of this will likely be enforced by a relatively new electronic intelligence unit called the FSSB. Make no mistake about it, the Russian state is becoming directly engaged in cyber war preparations. Official security departments like the FSSB are holding meetings with ISPs, ostensibly to coordinate their response strategies in the event of an attack against the Russian Federation. Also taking place in the region recently, a series of cyber attacks apparently staged by Muslim hacktivists in the Caucasus region. In early July, they knocked out several web pages which they claimed encouraged the killing of Muslims that were living in the area. They dubbed these sites havens for the enemies of Islam. They called themselves the Cyber Unit of Ansar and claim responsibility, among other things, for launching DDoS attacks against Chechen press and Chechnya Today. Realize that the Kremlin's assessment of its civilian cyber attack capacity as a strategic asset provides both motivation and encouragement officially for increasingly hostile cyber wars with its neighbors and hacktivism against any of their perceived enemies. It's believed that the government even establishes contracts with key Russian security researchers in an effort to better monitor political attack vectors. Fortunately, we believe that the truly dangerous hacktivism is likely to remain somewhat of a novelty, fueled mostly by the Russian economic crisis. It is the sustained expansion and refinement of Russia's crime cartels that remains the more prominent threat to the West. Remember, Russian cyber criminals have been operating for more than a decade with relative impunity. Their permissive environment has allowed them to expand, diversify, and develop their operations into many of the world's most robust and illicit cyber marketplaces. It's well documented that these cyber cartels operate in ways more akin to high-tech startups. The underground they comprise is, for Russian criminals, the safest place to conduct illicit business. Some have even begun attacking targets within their own country. This recent shift is clearly one cause for much of their parliament's recent legislative activity, which, by the way, was one of the many changes that iDefense correctly predicted for this year. According to Dennis Blair, Director of U.S. National Intelligence, the People's Republic of China is being very aggressive in cyberspace. His department's 2009 intelligence strategy warns that state and non-state actors, quote, are increasingly undermining U.S. interests in myriad and growing ways, unquote. While hacking often goes overlooked by the government there, internet censorship in China is heavily legislated. Inconceivable here in the U.S., most Chinese do generally welcome the idea of this legislation. Ironically, hacking is also so prevalent in China that it's become standard for businesses to attack each other this way. Just this past spring, two competing online gaming services who were vying for dominance involved internet users across 5 provinces within the country when a DDoS that was staged against the other by one of them essentially brought the entire network in those provinces to their knees. The reason for this was the ISP who controlled the network they DDoSed also happened to host one of the most popular video streaming sites in all of China. So the flood of unanswerable DNS activity is what actually crippled the network. Among several other interesting events in China, the government has banned the People's Liberation Army from outsourcing to civilian companies. This has not stopped the PLA from operating any of their front businesses, such as Tencent, China's most active social network, or from working with the criminal hacking group Asia Intelligence Center, who are led by a pretty shady guy with the handle Coldface. I think he read too much Dick Tracy when he was young. Nor has it kept them from working with the C. Rufus security team, who developed much of the code for GhostRat, which is a Trojan horse used by the Chinese to hack into some of the most sensitive computer networks on Earth. Brazil is increasingly becoming a key player in the global economic and political landscape, having no serious disputes with their neighbors and able to enjoy a fairly stable financial system. They have, however, some long-standing social problems, such as highly unequal distribution of wealth and an ineffective judicial system. Both boost crime in Brazilian society and cybercrime. Brazil, by the way, is the largest source of malicious cyber activity in Latin America and among the most active in the world. Financial cyber fraud dominates the Brazilian landscape, with a specialized community almost exclusively targeting Brazilian banks. Their highly skilled and active phishing community is rife with Trojan authors and ATM skimmers. Without laws in Brazil to address computer crime, law enforcement agencies are virtually hamstrung, and worse yet, there's a pervasive lack of cooperation between state and federal agencies in Brazil. The Brazilian cybersecurity community has adapted accordingly, with the banks implementing the bulk of security measures. They've even gone so far as to sponsor discussion lists, formal and informal security groups, and organized meetings to combat the cybercrime epidemic there. Brazilian lawmakers have made attempts at proposing cybercrime legislation, but they have failed repeatedly. One current project attempts to introduce cyber-specific issues into existing Brazilian laws. Unfortunately, the proposed laws include many burdensome provisions intended to facilitate investigation of cybercrimes. These provisions have angered the public, resulting in a considerable lobby against the law, arguing that ISPs and cyber cafes simply don't have the resources to comply. Let's see if I can point to it. This picture over here is actually of one of their protests. Now, realize that even with all of this, there have been several police successes. Just this past May, their federal police conducted Operation Track, a one-year investigation involving over 690 officers. They arrested a total of 139 people that were involved in various cyber fraud activities across 15 different individual criminal groups. One recent study showed that in just the first half of 2009, Brazilian authorities arrested nearly 350 people and seized over 70 skimming devices. Okay, let's talk a little bit more generally about the underground. iDefense has given one large segment of cybercriminal activity the label BBB attacks. These are phishing schemes used to target high-end executives of specific financial institutions. We call them BBB because the initial attacks that were discovered at iDefense were a very convincing bunch of phishing emails that used the U.S. Better Business Bureau. This chart from the last iDefense Trends report, if I can get it, there we go, shows activity for BBB attacks, the majority of which appear to come out of two Romanian cyber cartels, which iDefense has very cleverly labeled Group A and Group B. The Group A cartel has targeted more than 50 commercial Western banks, but was stopped in July of 2008 because the FBI arrested 30 of its members. Group B targeted more than 30 banks, but on April 24th of 2008, they stopped operation for some unknown reason, only to resume again in September. You see, the bad guys are targeting their attacks now because they've figured out that there's a difference between retail and commercial accounts. They realize that the commercial accounts were where the real money is. These are the accounts that the financial organizations use to transfer large sums of money between themselves and sometimes between large customers. The BBB cartels try to steal credentials for commercial accounts by targeting selected people in large companies with carefully crafted social engineering in the hope of circumventing the existing securities. And believe me, these attacks appear very realistic, often convincing the target to go and install a malicious ActiveX control designed to compromise their computer. Although the past and current BBB cartels had been focused on U.S. targets up until this year, iDefense correctly predicted that newer BBB attack variants were likely to target other geographic regions in 2009. Cyber criminals are becoming increasingly fond of databases, comprised of both personal and financial data. These are modern one-stop shopping sites on which criminals implement fully automated purchasing systems. Typically, these databases openly display indexed lists providing an inventory of stolen credentials, which are even searchable by the bank's ID number or BIN number. And with the count of credentials actually available from each BIN publicly accessible. Virtually any information is available from these sites, and it's offered from a smorgasbord menu of choices, usually priced by credits, with one credit often equaling roughly $1 US. Now, our old friend Zoomer is believed to be the brains behind one of the largest of these databases, the Private Collider system. A former student at the State University of Technology and Design in St. Petersburg, this veteran of the Shadow Crew Carters and old friend of Kumbajani unfortunately remains at large, partly due to several failed attempts at collaboration between Russian and U.S. law enforcement. Now, with the increasing popularity of personal firewalls, criminals have been forced to look for a new way to invade your computers. Enter the iframe. It's an effective means of propagating malware. Drive-by iframe-based installations have largely replaced worms as the primary mechanism for distribution of malicious content. You've all seen iframes. Their legitimate use is to embed content from a third party, like those annoying ads that you see, and essentially they direct your browser to grab that content from the page of a third party. This is really attractive to the commercial websites because it reduces the load on their servers and reduces to a degree the amount of content they have to generate themselves. What the hackers figured out was that an iframe didn't have to be that noticeable. In fact, you could make them so small as to be virtually imperceptible, turning an innocent-looking website into a carefully crafted trap. Better yet, thanks to web-enabled email readers and document editors, you can even embed iframes there, increasing the number of potential infection vectors substantially. For a typical iframe attack on a website, an HTML inline frame tag is hidden inside the code of a legitimate website, largely through SQL injection. Attackers use these iframes to covertly redirect your browser to a site that installs its nastiness. So the goal of the SQL injection attack is not to steal information, but instead to infect database-driven websites with malicious iframes that help them distribute their other malicious content. This way, when Grandpa visits his favorite online poker site, unknown to him, the computer he's using grabs some exploit code and runs it without his knowledge. This exploit code searches patiently until it finds a vulnerability it can exploit. It uses the opening to install some Trojan, keylogger, botnet onto his machine. Later, when he visits his online bank, the credentials he uses are recorded and quietly transmitted to the waiting fraudsters. Since secure coding practices are the only real defense against SQL injection attacks, which are at the core of this problem, and since every site with a database backend is a potential target, the burden of protecting your computers from iframes lays with the owner of the site. That's something to think about the next time some site offers you the chance to go to a random page. Attackers have formed a substantial economy around the distribution of malicious code through iframes, allowing them to specialize in infecting both websites and victims with their various exploit tools. This line of illicit trade has evolved so much that there are actually online forums you can visit specifically offering services from iframe-installed botnets offering either fixed prices or access to the highest bidder. Bulletproof hosting. Here's a technology that has seen somewhat easier times. This is how it works. A legitimate ISP sets up a hosting business where they knowingly sell services to illicit organizations and purposely avoid acting on complaints. They locate their criminal servers in countries that are usually more tolerant of cybercrimes, and thus they give their illicit customers a safe haven to evade prosecution. In his book, Cryptonomicon, Neil Stephenson actually predicted all this back in 2002. The now defunct Russian business network, which iDefense helped to bring down, was one example of a bulletproof hosting site. Since their breakup, other such providers have arisen around the world. There's been a lot of attention given to these guys lately, and in fact, the press has actually been very helpful at taking some of them offline by raising public awareness and law enforcement awareness of the specific offenders. Some other recent successful takedowns include the ISPs Intercage and Macolo. Anyone have any idea where they were based? California. In both cases, the media published overwhelming evidence proving the network's primary function was hosting malicious content. Eventually, the upstream providers agreed to take them offline, essentially shutting them down. HostFresh, a malicious outfit run out of Hong Kong, evaded being halted by the takedown of their original ISP, Intercage, but they were finally shut down when their new ISP, PACnet, was convinced to pull them offline, hopefully this time for good. This past August, the Latvian ISP, RealNet, was disconnected from the internet after being exposed as a cybercrime and bulletproof hosting hub. Among their hosted systems were numerous command and control bots for the ZeusNet, for the Zeus botnet. The takedown is especially significant because it marks the first time that this kind of a takedown has occurred in Eastern Europe. Let's talk in more detail now about botnets. We discussed how the bad guys can install botnet code using iframes. It was hinted that they use them to collect lots of illegal data and even to hide their various core servers. What we haven't talked about is how they actually work. Well, to paraphrase comedian Bill Cosby, I told you some of those stories, so I could tell you this one about fast flux networks. Fast flux is how modern cyber crooks create resilient, balanced networks of infected computers and use them to carry out malicious actions. In effect, turning the cyberspace hunt for bad guys into an internet-based game of whack-a-mole. The term fast flux refers to a constant and frequent parade of changes to the visibly defined criminal network. Say a fraudster wants to attack your bank. Their first step is to register a bogus domain name, preferably something no one would ever suspect, like fakebank.com. This allows them to create links that look convincing for phishing scams and other attacks. The key is that the bad guys own the registration for this criminal domain. By abusing features of DNS, such as the time to live or TTL value, they can change the IP address of the website associated with www.fakebank.com to anything they want, as often as they want. And that's exactly how they use their botnet of zombie systems. They stand up a DNS registration, providing a record that specifies initial details for the illicit domain's randomly selected current content servers. Those are actually a bunch of infected bots strewn across multiple ISPs, often in many countries. Thus, every time a user tries to go to fakebank.com, he's actually going to a different zombie. So when Grandma's computer first asks her ISP's name server for the address of fakebank.com, it looks at zombie 1, whose address is X. The next time she looks, the TTL has expired, so the address is refreshed, and she's told to go to zombie 2, whose address is Y. And this repeats on and on. This way, no single machine is ever active in the botnet for any length of time. With the zombies acting as transient proxies for a command and control mothership, fast flux effectively complicates tracking down the true center of operation. The mothership is the true host. The mothership may also be updating the DNS records on the name server. Fast flux, by the way, does not eradicate single points of failure for the bad guys. The mothership and the name servers are still vulnerable. But it does make it difficult to track them down, since you'd have to get access to one of the zombie systems, which are usually privately owned computers. By maintaining their rapidly changing network of unaware accomplices, and by exploiting the workings of DNS, Fast Flux does pretty well, though, when it masks the identity of a mothership. Anyone out there ever watch this movie? If you have, you may think it's awful. I certainly do. But during the first 15 minutes of this film, they give an excellent explanation of how Fast Flux works. So I highly recommend, if you want to know more, pick up this film, watch the first 15 minutes, then turn it off before you're really, really annoyed. Obviously, this film was released back in 2006, so Fast Flux is not that new. What is fairly new is a mutation. that we call double flux. Essentially, double flux works the same way but introduces extra layers of indirection by applying the same transitive adaptation to the fake domain's DNS servers as was done for the web page payloads. Since the bad guys own the fake domain, they can add as many arbitrary robot name servers for the domain as they like. This extra indirection makes tracking down the criminals nearly impossible. In the time it takes law enforcement to track down the robot that Grandpa's computer was just looking at, not only have the DNS and content servers changed, but the entire underlying infrastructure of the criminal network has changed. Since these dynamics are also infinitely scalable, enough layers of indirection can be used that traditional end-user protections, such as blacklisting, are virtually ineffective. Fortunately, we haven't seen this technique used that much in the wild yet. At this point, simple bulletproof hosting is still reasonably effective. Still, Fast Flux works well for those who are using it, and it is available to the broader criminal community whenever they're ready for it. In order to effectively combat this new tactic, unprecedented levels of action and cooperation are going to be required between registrars, ISPs, and the security community. This list, by the way, enumerates a bunch of mitigation options that have been suggested by the nonprofit cybersecurity group called the HoneyNet Project. It makes the challenge pretty clear because remember, ISPs and registrars both have a financial incentive not to act. The bad guys are paying customers, and taking them offline just because somebody else might complain is not something they're very fond of thinking about. Summing up, Fast Flux puts traditional phishing and iframe attacks on steroids. It uses manipulation of the DNS infrastructure to get massive numbers of concealed mercenary robots to do their bidding. A virtually untraceable network of resources completely under control of the bad guys. Okay, let's move on to some tipping points. At iDefense, we believe the cyber world has seen several recently. The impact of this is visible across the board. Cyber criminals are morphing into professional organizations. Religious extremists are using cyber fraud to help fund their agendas. Amateur hacker groups practice cyber espionage in the open in China. And cyber war has become a legitimate tool to accomplish political goals around the world. Cybercrime is evolving into big business. Illicit organizations have moved beyond dipping their toes in the water. They're beginning to find new and creative ways to branch out and protect their infrastructure. These cybercrime groups now inhabit the same type of space that drug cartels of the early 80s did. The modern cyber cartel is a durable, semi-formal criminal organization that thinks and operates like a business. Indeed, the best cyber cartels will become functionally almost indistinguishable from legitimate firms, with the exception being that they run a greater risk because they're doing something illegal. For almost 2 decades before the cartels, hackers operated independently or in loose, informal groups. Some of these groups remain, but they've been eclipsed in relevance. Several governments have begun taking the reins, utilizing public opinion to encourage DDoS attacks and site defacements, and reaching out through officially sanctioned programs to start building trained corps of cyber warriors as another paramilitary asset for political conflicts. The evidence for this is very strong in China, and we're starting to see equal hints in Russia. Even political and religious activism has found a home in cyberspace, establishing footholds on the web to spread propaganda and even contracting out for services to discredit and harass their ideological opponents. cyber espionage groups have begun to discover that contract services can be pretty lucrative, turning them into cyber mercenaries. Okay, for the remainder of the presentation, I'll shift our gaze away from the here and now and start taking a peek over the horizon at what we believe are some important new technologies and phenomena that you may not be thinking about yet and probably should be. These are what we call security disruptors. You've all heard about business disruptors before, I'm sure. These are technologies or ideas that come around and fundamentally change how a particular business segment runs. Here are two examples. You've all probably seen this on the left, the combination of iTunes and iPods. They have changed how the music industry sells music. Before they came along, there were MP3 players and music sites, but they didn't make it convenient and cost-effective for people to use. This has fundamentally changed. On the right side is an example that's a little bit older. Before Gutenberg made his movable type printing press, reading and writing were something for the privileged elite. Gutenberg's process made it cheap and easy to reproduce the written word and completely changed the process of communicating ideas and preserving knowledge throughout the world. We believe that security disruptors exist also. These are the technologies and cultural phenomena which are evolving today that will have a cyberspace impact within the next 10 to 15 years. I want to talk about four specific examples real quick. The first is the invariable tendencies of governments to overreact through excessive legislation. Anyone who's filled out a handful of HIPAA acknowledgement forms at the doctor's or taken their shoes off for the TSA at an airport knows what I'm talking about. The security community regularly debates exactly what cyber terrorist attacks might look like, but iDefense defines them both by what they are and what they aren't. And it's generally agreed that there hasn't yet ever been a true act of cyber terrorism. But experts worry that there definitely will be one within the next 10 to 15 years. The security disruptor here is not the attack, it's the reaction to the attack, the tendency of governments to over-legislate something they don't yet properly understand. Let me see a quick show of hands. How many of you either know someone who has one of these or has one themselves? Okay, good. These are not your grandmother's cell phones. These are not your mother's cell phone. These are the tip of a very big iceberg. Mobile phones and PDAs have been around for years. All along, security pundits, including iDefense, have been claiming that this would be the year the criminals go after the mobile platforms. Until recently, there hasn't been any money in it. And the devices didn't have the kind of functionality or the connectivity to make them as valuable as a laptop or a desktop. This has all changed. Today's smartphone can do almost anything that a home computer can, and cheaper. Did you know, for example, that in Japan they've developed an iPhone app that lets you pay for things from a vending machine using your phone? In Brazil, there's a startup that's built an app that has 60,000 users already that essentially lets you use your phone like a credit card. You go into a store, you buy what you want to purchase, and it shows up on your phone bill at the end of the month. To paraphrase Walt Mossberg of the Wall Street Journal, it is raining super smart phones. He was referring to the iPhone and the new spate of similar devices that have popped up around it. Ralph de la Vega, CEO of AT&T, called the iPhone a computer that just happens to also be a phone. These are no longer simple devices that do fancy things using SMS trickery. These are computer devices with real operating systems that have network connectivity and also happen to have a phone. Maybe more importantly, there is money to be had. The business world has finally cracked the code and figured out how to make megabucks by transforming the super smart portable devices from a niche industry into a widely affordable commodity. Trouble is, until very recently, nobody was really thinking about the security implications. And believe me, these things are easy to hack because the vendors are providing the tools. Why? Because they want more killer apps. They want you to go out and write things that make their products valuable. The main internet access platform is shifting from the computer to the mobile device. Personal, professional data, entertainment, proprietary information, all already reside on these devices for many people. The disruptor here is that the strategies for securing them is embryonic, virtually non-existent. Good example of this, anybody here have an iPhone? You think it's hard for me to hack it? All I have to do to get everything you have on your iPhone is plug it into a USB cord that docks with my computer. I get everything, no passwords, no encryption, no protection for you. Ever seen these guys before? These guys just this past August presented a whole slew of smartphone hacks at the annual Black Hat Conference in Las Vegas, including several for the iPhone. Among the things that they've done is they've designed a hacking kit for the hardware. And what this kit does is it lets them trick the phone into thinking it's on the cellular network. This way, they can much more quickly run their attempts to hack the phone without risking going to jail by inadvertently bringing down the carrier. Then there's this little adjustment to the internet that we also think is a disruptor. IPv6. We all know it's coming. It's needed. Experts have been saying for quite some time that by 2012 we are going to be out of IPv4 addresses. We believe that the worldwide adoption of IPv6 will be another major disruptor. To understand why, let me tell you a little that'll give you perspective between the old protocol, IPv4, and the new one. If you could draw a map that had every one of the IPv4 addresses, you could fit it on the petals of a flower. Contrasting, the IP addresses for IPv6 would fill the solar system. Let me repeat that. The solar system. When the world adopts IPv6, everything is going to have an IP address. Every room in your house, every lock, every piece of furniture, every appliance is going to have an IP address. God knows how many your cars or even your pets are going to have. Now, it's no secret that the Chinese have already adopted IPv6. In fact, during the Olympics last year, they rolled it out. They're not transitioning, they rolled it out. In contrast, the US probably won't complete deploying the new protocol until sometime around 2020. The point to all this is that any innovation that takes advantage of this new protocol will most likely not come from the West. Whatever the next big thing is, the thing that everybody's going to want to have, it's probably going to come from Asia. Okay, I'm not exactly sure what IPv6 will really mean to businesses, but I do know that it's going to impact a lot of things. Even Google has seen this. They obtained IPv6 addresses back in 2005, but they didn't begin architecting a network until 2007. It's likely going to fall to a lot of smart people like you guys to really figure out how all of this is going to affect business. Last year, ICANN, the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, authorized the use of non-Roman characters in top-level domain names. Non-English speaking users will no longer have to end web addresses in .com or .net. They can register the last part of their web address in their own native language. One possible outcome for this is that the internet as we know it today may fragment, moving away from being a global engine of e-commerce to a patchwork of siloed networks based on country of origin and run by individual governments, some of whom do not value the concept of freedom of speech the way we do, like Russia and China. Potentially, these changes will have a cyberspace impact comparable to the biblical Tower of Babel. Okay, I've been burning your ears for a while now, and hopefully I've given you some good things to think about. One of the things you should really try and remember, though, is that there is a lot going on in the cybersecurity landscape. A lot more than I've touched on. In fact, this barely scratched the surface. In fact, there's so much going on that earlier this year, iDefense was able to put together a pretty substantial book just on the subject of cyber fraud. Hopefully, we'll be doing a lot more books in the near future. That's pretty much it for my presentation, so I'd like to thank you all for coming, and I'd be happy to answer any questions if you have them. Anybody? All right then. Thank you very much.